There are some moments in life when you hear something so heartbreaking, so desperate, that it reaches deep into your soul. And that night, I heard it. A sound I'll never forget. A cry, a feeble, quaking, despairing wail. I initially assumed it was simply the wind whipping through vacant streets, but then I heard it again. Faint, broken, begging. I stopped in my tracks. I couldn't breathe. My breath caught in my throat. I was never meant to be there. It was late. I had never taken the long way home, but for whatever reason that night, I did. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was something more. And then I saw him. He was barely moving, his body so thin I could see the shape of his ribs, his once golden fur reduced to mud and dirt, and his eyes, they weren't just tired. They weren't just in pain. They were empty, like he had resigned himself to that flick of fate. I felt something tightened in my chest. How long had he been here? How long had he stayed on his own, shivering in the cold, with nobody to care about him, no one to even know he was there? I took a step closer. "Hey, bud," I said, whispering as if any noise I made might shatter the rain. No response. He didn't even flinch. It was as though he had already despaired of the notion that a human being could ever mean well. My hands shook as I dug into my pocket. I had a half-eaten granola bar, hardly fit for a starving dog though, and it was all I had. I snapped off a piece and gently extended it. He didn't move, didn't even lift his head. My heart sank. What had the world ever done to him? But then, just as I was about to retract my hand, a minuscule, barely perceptible motion. His nose twitched, his eyes flickered. For the first time, a spark of something flared in his empty gaze. Hope, curiosity, desperation. I didn't know. But what I did know, or that this moment would alter everything, and neither of us would be the same again. They say certain moments change your life forever. This was one of those moments for me. I looked on, heart in my chest, breath hot. I had discovered him, this frail, shattered spirit. But what now? What do you tell an abandoned dog? Who has learned the hard way that people mean pain? How do you persuade a person who has absolutely no hope that they are worthy of being saved? I crouched, moving slow enough not to make a noise. "Hey, buddy," I whispered again. My voice was soft, gentle, just a breath, really, in the frigid air of the night. He didn't react. Not a flinch, not a blink. It was as though he had already resigned himself to whatever destiny awaited him. My chest tightened. I knew that look. I had witnessed it before, not in a dog, but in people. People who had given up, those who had lost everything. And now he was here, a small, quaking life on the brink of existence. I extended the tiny chunk of granola bar. Not much, but something. He didn't move at first, but then a flicker. His nose twitched. A small gasp, a barely audible gasp. And then, after so long, his sunken eyes lifted to meet mine. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. There was something in his eyes, something raw. A kind of silent desperation is the only way I can describe it. Not trust, not yet, but something close. I didn't move, didn't dare. Instead, I waited. And then, it happened. He shakily, even painfully, lifted his paw only slightly from the cold, wet soil. A silent gesture, a question. "Are you here to hurt me, or are you different?" A lump rose in my throat. I gingerly set the food down on the pavement, giving him room. Still, he hesitated. The rain continued to fall, soaking us both, but at that moment I hardly cared. All I could see was him. This tiny, fragile soul, deciding whether he could muster the strength to hope. Seconds felt like hours, and then, Finally. He moved, writing with shaky, unsteady strokes, his body so weak, so frail. He leaned in, sniffed the food tentatively, then cautiously pressed his lips to a small, tiny bite. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Because in that moment, he chose to fight. A choice to try, a choice to fight, a choice to believe. And that was the start of something neither one of us could ever have expected. They say trust is earned. And for those who were broken, trust is the most difficult thing to offer. I knew this wouldn't be easy. This wasn't a dog crazed from hunger. This was not a stray looking for something to eat. This was a soul left behind, a heart that once was shattered. And the worst part, he had accepted it. Somewhere along the line, he had decided no one was coming. That kindness was a dream he could no longer afford to believe in. And now, here I was, a stranger, kneeling in the rain, extending a shaky hand, begging for something he no longer knew how to provide. I held watch as he chewed the morsel, his movements slow, labored. His ribs swelled and sank beneath his brittle skin, each breath a chore. This wasn't just hunger. This was starvation. How long had it been since he had had a proper meal? Since he had felt warmth? Because someone had just cared? I swallowed hard. What sort of monster abandons a dog like this? What kind of world allows something so innocent to suffer so much? That thought sent my fists clenching. But this was not the time for anger. Now was the time for saving. Again, I reached out, just a touch. Slow, cautious. No sudden movements, no pressure. "He's safe now," I whispered. My voice was steady, but inside my heart broke. His ears twitched slightly. I held my breath. And then he flinched, all his muscles tensed as if he'd been struck, like he had been hit before, like he knew what came next. I felt my stomach drop. Someone had hurt him. Someone had taught him that hands weren't for loving, but for hurting. My fingers curled into my palm, but I made myself relax. This wasn't about me. This was about him. I leaned back a little to give him room. "Easy. I'm not going to hurt you." He didn't believe me. Not yet. But he hadn't run. That meant something. It meant that inside, despite everything, some part of him still wanted to believe in goodness. And I would hold on to that, no matter how small. I pulled off my jacket slowly so I wouldn't startle him. It was soaked, but still hotter than the cold pavement under him. I placed it gently on the ground next to him, not touching him, just nearby. His eyes flickered to it. A test. A silent offer. Would he accept comfort? Or was he too far gone? I held my breath and waited. Trust is fragile. Once it's broken, it's never the same. And as I stood there, on that freezing, desolate street, I knew this wasn't just about food. It wasn't only about survival. This was a story about a soul who had forgotten the meaning of being loved. I remained still with my body, sore from the chill, but I didn't budge, didn't force him, didn't rush him. Because if I had learned one lesson in life, it was this: we need time to heal broken things. I let him make the next move. His body quaked, weak with hunger, but his eyes flickered towards my jacket. He was observing it, analyzing it. It was a test. Would it hurt him? Would it trap him? Or was it safe? Seconds passed like hours. And then a shift, a slight and scarcely perceptible motion. At first, just his nose. A cautious sniff. There was no threat in the damp, ragged cloth. Then his paw, tentative, unsure, ever so lightly grazed the hem of my jacket. I held my breath. My heart raced, pumping in my ears. Would he retreat? Would he run? Or would he stay? And then a decision. With a slow, pained movement, he twirled his fragile body toward the jacket. Not fully on it, not fully trusting, but closer. And at that moment, something broke in me. Because this wasn't just a dog who lay down, this was a soul gambling on the unknown. A hope that perhaps, just perhaps, someone cared. I released a quavering breath, my eyes stinging. I wanted to reach out, to touch him, to tell him that he was safe. But I knew. Too much, too soon, and I'd lose him. So I did what I could do. I stayed. I waited. And for the first time that evening, so did he. Fear is heavy. It sits in your bones, courses through your soul, and those who have known nothing but pain, it becomes a second skin. As I sat with him, cold beside him that night, I could feel it, the weight of his fear. He had spent so long running, so long expecting the worst, and now here he was, inches away from me. Not because he trusted me, not because he was confident I wouldn't harm him, but because, for the first time in what might have been a long time, he wanted to believe. I could see it in his eyes, the way they flashed between me and the darkness beyond, like he was trapped in two different realms, one where he ran and one where he stayed. I didn't move, didn't reach out. Instead, I allowed him to just be, because sometimes that's all someone needs. The rain had stopped. The city surrounding us was silent now, except for the occasional distant sound of a car driving by. But in this tiny forgotten corner of the world, for us, it was just us. Him and me, a broken dog, and a stranger who wouldn't turn and walk away. My muscles were stiff from the chill, and my clothes wet from the rain. But none of that mattered, because as I sat there, watching him, I realized something. This was not just about rescuing a dog, this was about saving a life. And in some weird way, maybe it was about saving my own as well. A gust of wind swept down the alley, and he shivered. He instinctively curled in on himself, his fragile body attempting to hold on to any heat it might muster. I hated seeing him like this. He was so small, so fragile, and somehow, for the first time, I thought of something that made my stomach turn. What if I had never walked down this street? What if I had failed to hear his cry? Is he out of the woods now? Would he have made it through the night? Or would this lonely, neglected corner have been his final resting place? The idea squeezed my chest tighter. Number that wasn't an option, not anymore. I had to get him out of here. But how? He was weak, scared. Would it panic if I tried to pick him up? Would he fight? Or worse, would he go mute altogether? I had seen it before. Animals who had been abused for so long, so often, they didn't even flinch anymore. They just gave up. And the idea of him getting to that place, of him giving up even the tiniest shard of hope, something deep inside me started to burn. I took a deep breath out, trying to calm down. "Okay, buddy," I whispered. His ears perked up when they heard my voice. He was listening. That was good. "I don't know what you've been through," I said then, in a voice barely above a whisper. "But I swear to you, it's over now." I looked into his eyes, and for a moment it was there, a glimmer of something delicate. Doubt, hope, fear, all wound up in those weary, honey-colored eyes. I extended my hand, slow, careful, deliberate. And then, the moment of truth. He flinched, not much. A little involuntary twitch, that's all. But he didn't run. He didn't run. And that was more than enough to get my heart racing. I held my hand steady, palm up, fingers relaxed. "I won't hurt you," I said in a whisper again. "I promise." Another gust of wind, another shiver, and then, ever so slowly, He moved toward me. Not much, not fully. Just enough for me to feel his breath warm on my skin. And in that moment, I knew. We had just made the first real step towards something that neither of us had dared to hope for. Trust. They say a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. For him, that step was not only physical, it was emotional. That was the step between fear and trust, between pain and healing, between the only life he had known and the life he could have. And then, in this quiet, neglected alley, he was hovering at the brink of that decision. He was breathing shallowly, his body shaking. He was tired, hungry, weak. But more than anything, he was torn. His instincts were to run, to stay away, to not trust hands which can so easily do harm. But his heart told him to stay, to believe, to hope, to try. I could see it all unfold in his eyes, the hesitation, the doubt, a war of silence, survival over surrender. And I realized something then. This wasn't just my choice. It was his. I couldn't force him. I couldn't snatch him up, tote him off, choose for him. If this was going to matter at all, he had to choose it. I did the only thing anyone could do. I left the decision up to him. I eased back slowly and with care, each action measured. "I know that you're scared," I whispered, barely over a whisper. His ears twitched. "But you don't need to be," I said. "Not anymore." He was looking at me, his golden eyes shining with something I couldn't put a name to. I reached out again, palm up, open, steady. An invitation, not a demand, not a command, just a chance. His nose twitched. His ears pricked back a little, and then a movement. So small, so hesitant, but there, a tiny shuffle forward. My heart pounded. "Yeah, that's it, buddy," I said, whispering. "You got this." He paused. His breaths came unevenly. His ribs heaved. His entire body appeared to tremble from the gravity of the choice. And then, he did a thing that broke me to pieces, something so simple, so small, yet so unbelievably powerful. He lowered his head, not in fear, not in submission, but in acceptance, like for the first time he was shedding the burden he had borne for so long. My throat felt tight, and I swallowed hard. This was it. This was the moment. I reached out, slow, steady. I felt his fur with my fingers, wet, cold, thin. I could feel his entire body stiffen under my hands. But he didn't pull away. He didn't flinch. He just let it happen. I exhaled a breath I hadn't known I was holding. "That's it," I whispered. "You're safe now." He blinked slowly, tiredness pulling at him. For the first time, I understood how tired he was. How long had he been fighting? How many nights had he been out here, cold and alone, with no one to give a damn if he lived or died? How many times had he wished he could just close his eyes and never open them again? But tonight, he wasn't alone. I didn't think I could leave him here. Not now, not after this, but the next step was equally horrifying. I had to pick him up, carry him, take him somewhere safe. Would he let me? Or would this little bit of trust I'd just established shatter the moment I tried? I exhaled slowly. There was only one way to see if they could detect human emotion. There are times in life when time stands still, when nothing else exists except the flimsy, trembling, fragile spirit standing before you. And in that instant, there was nothing else. Just him. This pathetic, starving, exhausted little dog who had spent far too long fighting for a life that never once fought for him. And me, a stranger, a nobody, just a person who had made a choice to stop, a choice to listen, a choice to care. And now I had one final decision to make. I had to help him cross over from this life, but would he let me? Or had I already pressed my luck too far? Breathe out, slowly. Steady yourself. Okay, buddy, I quietly said, my voice soft but firm. His ears flicked slightly. He was still listening. That was a good sign. I noticed I was moving slowly, transitioning to a crouch, posture open, non-aggressive. Everything had to be slow, controlled, predictable. Because if I moved too fast, if I reached too suddenly, I could lose everything. I put out my hand, letting him see first and feel second. His eyes, weary and heavy, flicked in my direction. He didn't move away, didn't flinch, didn't retreat. A good sign. My fingers brushed lightly across his wet fur. Still no reaction. I swallowed. This was it. I repositioned myself a little, and I nestled in his arms. A slow, deliberate motion. But the moment I applied the slightest pressure, he froze. Every muscle in his frail body tensed, and he froze. Breath hitched. I stopped instantly. My heart pounded. He wasn't growling, wasn't snapping, wasn't fighting. But he wasn't unsuspicious either. Not yet. His instincts told him to withdraw, to run. But his body, too weak, too tired, too broken. And that, more than anything, tightened my chest with something between heartbreak and rage. What had the world done to him? What had people done to him? That even when he was down to nothing, even at the absolute brink of survival, he still couldn't believe in kindness fully? I blinked hard, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Easy, buddy," I murmured. I know it's hard." I gave him time, kept my hands still, kept my breathing slow, and then, after what seemed like forever, he exhaled. Not a big movement, just a soft, shaky breath, a surrender, a grim, reluctant acceptance, and that was all I needed. I stepped again, more sure this time. I slid my arms under him, hoisting his wasted body against my chest. He was light, too light, just skin and bones, with the barest trace of what had once been strength. As soon as he took flight, I knew. The stiffening of those muscles, the minute instinctive jerk of panic. But then, he went still, not in fear, not in resistance, but in resignation. Because maybe, just maybe, somewhere amid that fragmented heart of his, he was starting to believe. I wrapped him tight, protecting him from the chill. For the first time in perhaps weeks, perhaps months, he could feel warmth, safe, not alone. I could feel his slow, uneven breaths on my chest. He still felt the little tremors running through his body. And in that instant, I took a vow in silence. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I won't let you go. They say the most difficult thing about healing is believing you deserve it. And at that moment, with him against my chest, I understood. He wasn't sure yet. He didn't know if this was true, if this was safe. That was if this was something that could last. He was trapped in that delicate in-between of fear and hope, between running and staying, between giving up and holding on. And all I could do at this point was keep moving forward. I readjusted my grip, wrapping him tighter. He was too light, too fragile of a body. I could feel each bone beneath his thin fur, every tremor that coursed through him. But he wasn't fighting me. That alone was a miracle. I started walking, step by step, out of the darkness, out of the alleyway no one cares to remember, and into something new. The streets were quiet, the pavement slick from rain earlier. I could hear his slow, uneven breaths in my chest. He was exhausted. I think he was more tired than he'd ever been. But he wasn't sleeping, not yet. His ears would twitch every now and then, body stiffening slightly at the sound of a passing car. He was still on edge, still expecting the kindness to eventually run out, because in his world, kindness never lasted. I knotted my arms around him a little more, silent comfort. "I got you, buddy," I said softly. No reaction, but he had heard me. I knew he had. Because he was still here, that was enough for now. My apartment wasn't far, 10-minute walk at most. But tonight, cradling his frail body in my own arms, it was the longest walk of my life. Every step mattered. Every breath mattered. Because this wasn't simply about bringing a dog home. This was about starting over. For him, for me, for both of us. As we approached my building, I sensed it. A tiny shift. A subtle, barely noticeable shift in how he lay in my arms. It wasn't much, a little bit less tension. A trace of relaxation, like maybe, just maybe. He was starting to believe that this wasn't yet another gimmick, another disappointment, another loss. That perhaps, for the first time in a very long time, he wasn't alone anymore. I got to my door and stopped, readjusting my grip to reach my keys. That's when it happened. Such a tiny sound, such a small sound that I almost didn't hear it. A sigh. A long, slow exhalation, as if the world had been resting on his chest for far too long, and it was beginning to lift for the first time. I swallowed, my throat constricting. "Yeah, buddy," I whispered. "You're safe now." Then I unlocked the door and stepped inside. They say that the most difficult thing about beginning again is believing that you can. For him, that first night wasn't simply about a new place. It was about a far larger thing, for something far more terrifying. The thought that perhaps, just perhaps, his suffering was finally at an end. But after all that he'd been through, after all the nights in the cold, after all the hunger, after all the pain, how do you explain to a heart that has known suffering that it's safe to hope again? I waited there a moment, the door having closed behind me. The world outside was gone. It was just him and me now. I took a slow breath out, reminded myself how I was holding his fragile frame. His ribcage quivered and heaved under his thin, matted fur. He was tired. So unbelievably tired. But he wasn't asleep. Not yet. His eyes remained half open, watching, waiting. Like he still wasn't sure whether this was real, like he still thought something would go wrong. There was a spasm in the middle of my chest, because the truth was, I understood. I was a little careful, as I did not want to startle him. The last thing I wanted to do was to destroy the fragile trust we had just built. I dropped to one knee by the couch and eased him down on a soft, warm blanket I had rippled from the wall. The moment he sensed the change, the warmth underneath him rather than the cold pavement. His body stiffened, his breathing hitched. I froze, watching him. He was on edge again, like he was expecting something terrible to happen, for someone to yell, for someone to push him off, for that warmth to be snatched away as suddenly as it arrived, because that was what he was used to, wasn't it? Temporary kindness, a moment of relief, just to be followed by more pain. It brought me up short, and I swallowed hard, as if trying to swallow the lump in my throat. "It's okay, buddy," I said. "It's just a blanket." He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't seem to believe me. I leaned in closer and gently pulled the edges of the blanket tighter around him. He flinched, but he didn't run. I let out a slow breath. This was going to take time, and I was willing to give him as long as he needed. I sat down next to him, maintaining a slight distance, not too close, not too far, just enough that he would know I was there. I didn't speak, didn't force anything. I just let the moment exist, because at times silence is the greatest consolation. And after a while, something shifted. His breath began to slow. He relaxed slightly, and his body, so tense, was a little less tense. Not fully, not completely, but enough. I saw that his sharp and guarded eyes, previously vigilant, began to droop. His blinks became slower. His head involuntarily dipped in a blanket. He was fighting it, fighting the exhaustion, struggling against the notion that he could finally rest. Because resting meant trust. Resting meant letting go. And for a dog who had spent his entire life checking his rear, it was the hardest thing to do. I picked up a small bowl of water I'd left sitting before and put it next to him, just in case. He barely noticed. His body had already begun succumbing to the exhaustion tugging at him. And then, one moment I would remember for life. Such a tiny moment, such a simple moment, but such a massively huge moment. He sighed, not in fear, not in pain, but in relief. His eyes fluttered closed. His thin frame finally, truly relaxed. And for the first time since I had discovered him, he slept. They say the way you wake up. I can tell you all about how safe you feel. For most dogs, waking up entails stretching, yawning, possibly wagging a tail. For him, waking up had always meant living. It had meant staying alert. It had included never appearing complacent. Because the moment you do, that's when something bad goes down. I sat nearby, trying not to move around too much. I had barely slept. Not because I was feeling uncomfortable, not because I was tired, except because I couldn't stop watching him. I had never witnessed a creature so deeply involved in sleep, so completely. And yet, simultaneously, I had never seen anyone sleep so fragile, almost as if, even in his dreams, he was still expecting the moment it would all be taken away. I wanted to tell him he was safe, that he didn't have to be afraid anymore. But I knew. To those who have only known broken promises words mean nothing, it had to be shown. The light brightened, spreading across the floor, and then a twitch. His paw shifted slightly, his ears flicked. He felt his breath catch for a moment, and then his eyes opened. It wasn't sudden, not a startled jolt, not a panicked reaction. It was slow, cautious, like he was awakening in an unfamiliar place, somewhere he wasn't certain had happened. He braced instinctively. He didn't stretch first thing, as a lot of advice told him to do. Wasn't yawn. It was listen for danger, for movement, to the sound of feet that spelled trouble. His eyes flicked to the door, then to the walls, then to me. Our eyes locked, and for a split second, I didn't breathe. And because I saw the question in his eyes, is this real? Am I still safe? I remained perfectly still as he absorbed his surroundings, allowing him to decide what this meant. He blinked, confused. This was not the cold pavement. This was not the sound of rain on concrete. This was soft, warm, quiet. His breath was still labored, though it wasn't from fear, from uncertainty, from figuring out what exactly had happened. I reached over, slow, careful, grabbing the small bowl of water I'd nearby left. "Hey, buddy," I said softly. My voice caused his ears to perk a little bit. Recognition, that was new. I nudged the bowl closer. He didn't move at first, didn't reach for it, didn't trust it. I didn't push, didn't force. I just waited, and then he sniffed. A tiny, hesitant movement. One was lapping water, slowly lapping water and lifting its bloody head and licking the edge of the water. Just once. testing. Like he wasn't certain if this was a trick. Like he didn't know if it was his to have. My chest constricted, and I swallowed hard. How long had this been going on? How long had he been without something as basic as the knowledge that water belonged to him? He took another sip, then another. Small, careful, but real. He wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. For the first time in this new place and in this new world, he had just awakened within. He was accepting, not fully, not completely, but enough. And for today, that was all that mattered. They say it is not a straight line to healing. It's messy, unpredictable. So many steps forward and steps back. And here he was at the moment that I noticed him lying there, still reluctant, still uncertain. I realized that this didn't mean that he was done being afraid. Not yet. But that was the start of something new. He had let me touch him. That was a big deal for a dog like him. But now we were up against the next challenge. Would he make this first step into this new life? Would he stand? Would he walk? Would he even want to? I had no idea, but there was only one way to find out. So I held my breath and bent a little forward. "All right, buddy," I said, forcing my voice to be steady, calm. His ears twitched. He was listening, still watching, still waiting. I leaned back an inch, creating some space. I wanted him to be aware that this was a choice. It was his. If he wanted to, he could stay curled up. He could rest, wait, process, or he could get up and walk into something new. Seconds passed. Then a shift, not much. Just a little jump in his shoulders, a glimmer of thought in his weary gaze. He was thinking about it. But thinking wasn't enough. He had to decide. I reached for the small plate of food I had placed nearby. Soft, easy to eat. Something light but filling. Something that said, "This is yours." I pushed it forward slightly. His eyes flickered to it. But he didn't move. Didn't reach for it. Not yet. I sat back, waiting. Giving him time. Giving him space. Because for him, this was not just eating. It wasn't merely a fuel for his stomach. This was about trust, about believing that this wasn't going to be temporary, that this wasn't some other trick, that this wasn't another false hope moment before the rug was pulled out from under him again. Because that's how life had taught him, isn't that so? That nothing ever good lasted, that kindness was fleeting, that warmth was a lie. And I knew it wasn't going to happen overnight and undoing all of that. But then, a movement, tiny, hesitant, but there, his paw, thin, shaky, moved forward a mere inch, then another. I held my breath. Was he actually going to? Then he pushed himself up. It was weak. His thighs quavered underneath him. But he stood. He stood for the first time in God knows how long. It felt like something had tightened in my chest. Not just pride, not just relief, but something deeper, something heavier. Because it was not just a dog standing up. This was a soul, right? That was choosing to fight, to keep going, to keep living. And when he took a slow, unsteady step toward the food, his ribs still sharp beneath his fragile skin, his breath still uneven, I knew. It was his first step, really, into his new life. They say time heals all wounds, but what they fail to report is some wounds don't just fade. Some wounds stay, the wounds that are a part of you. And for him, his past was not something that could be left behind. It was still inside him, still forming his view of the world, still murmuring to him that he wasn't safe. Not yet. Not really. He had eaten. That alone was a victory. But now came the hard part. learning to live again, learning to trust. And trust, that wasn't something that could be manufactured. It had to be earned, and I knew I was going to have a tough climb. I reached across, slow, careful, picking up the empty plate. His ears flicked back. A small reaction, barely noticeable. But I saw it. And more importantly, I felt it, that brief moment of indecision. The yappy little cower just before the squeal. It wasn't much, but it was enough for me to know one thing. He was still waiting for something terrible to happen. I didn't move suddenly, didn't do anything to trigger him. Instead, I got up in the same position I had gotten down. Slow, deliberate, showing him every movement before it would happen. And to show him nothing here would be a surprise. Because surprises were dangerous. Surprises also meant a hand shot out too quickly. A voice raised too loud. A jarring change that signaled pain was on the way. And even though I'd never harmed him, despite doing nothing but attempt to be kind to him, his body still remembered. His body was still expecting the worst. Because fear like that runs deep. "No," I said, taking the plate to the sink, my head whirring. What had happened to him? Who had done this? Who had taught him to be afraid of every twitch? To prevaricate at the slightest move? To prepare for the worst even during a time of peace? My teeth ground, the frustration simmering in my chest held at bay. Not at him. Never at him. But in the world that had shattered him like this. Because no living creature, no soul, never assigned to live like this. I turned back, looking across the room at him. He hadn't moved. He was right exactly where I'd left him. Still sitting, still watching, still waiting. I let out a slow breath. This wasn't just about food. This wasn't only about finding a roof over his head. This was about letting go of fear. And doing that was going to require more than time. First, it was going to take patience. And more than anything else, it was going to take love. I walked back over, sitting down on the floor again, keeping my posture relaxed, keeping my body open, not forcing anything, not expecting anything, just being here, just existing with him. Because to him, that was the true test, Daleme, not whether I would just be kind today, only whether I'd still be here based on tomorrow. And the day after that. And the day after that. Because kindness? For him, helplessness had always worn off. Kindness was temporary. And right now, he was still waiting to see whether I would be too. He blinked slowly, his body still taut, but a little less so now. As if perhaps, he was starting to believe. Not fully, not completely, but enough. And for today, that was all I needed. They say there are stages of healing, but what they don't tell you is sometimes healing comes with a price. Sometimes the past refuses to set you free. Then it pulls you back in. And right now, I could see it happening. He had eaten. He had let me touch him. He had stepped into this new life for the first time. But deep inside, I knew. He was still waiting for the moment it would all be ripped from him. Because for dogs like him, for survivors like him, nothing good ever lasted. And the scars of that belief, they don't just up and vanish in an overnight. I sat on the floor once more, allowing him space, not forcing anything, not rushing him, just being here. He was used to my presence now, not comfortable yet, not fully trusting, but used to it. Used to the way I moved, the way I spoke, the way I never tried to control him. And that was progress, real progress. But just as I was ready to allow myself to think that maybe, just maybe, he was really starting to heal, it happened. A sound. One single sound. A loud bang from outside, a car door slamming, flipping out a noise, sharp, shattering. To me, it was nothing. To him, it was everything. His body froze. Completely. Every muscle locked up. His breathing stopped. His ears went flat so quickly, so forcefully, I barely had time to react. And then, panic. Pure, unfiltered panic. He crawled backward, spilling the empty water bowl. His claws dragged against the ground. His ribs rose and fell in shallow, desperate breaths. And in his eyes, I saw terror, not fear, terror. Like his brain had deserted this space, like he was in a different world altogether. Somewhere dark, somewhere dangerous, somewhere that had shown him to expect pain. "Hey, hey," I said fast, my voice low, steady. But he wasn't hearing me. Not really. Unable to concentrate enough on where he was going to not run into things, even though the body he used to inhabit remained here. He was breathing sharply and erratically. His eyes darted, searching. For what? For an exit? For a way out? For someone? Something that was no longer present? I didn't know. But I knew one thing. I had to bring him back. I stayed perfectly still, didn't move toward him, didn't reach out. Because right now, touch wasn't comfort. Touch was a threat. I softened my voice. "Buddy, look at me." Nothing. His breath came too fast, his whole body shaking. I tried again. Hey, you're safe." Still nothing. Seconds became as long as eternity. I could almost see his brain moving, weighing his options. Fight or flight, pain or survival. Stay or run, but then something changed. His eyes flicked to mine. Just for a second. Just a fraction of a second. But it was enough. A connection. A moment of clarity. A reminder that he wasn't by himself. I breathed in slowly, maintaining a relaxed posture. "You're okay," I whispered. Another second passed. Then another. And then his breathing slowed. Not a lot. Not completely. But just enough. Enough time for his body to stop trembling. Dull enough for the wild panic in his eyes. Enough for him to stay. Not because he was trapped, not because he had no other option, but because this time, he chose to. I felt my chest tighten, because I knew this was his real test, not the food, not the first touch, not the first step, but this moment, this struggle with his own mind. And he had won. Not fully, not forever. But for today, he had wrestled with the ghosts of his past, and he didn't let them win.